Hello chess friends and welcome to part 2 of Crazyhouse openings. It's GM Max Illingworth here, and for this video we're continuing off from part 1. In part 1 we looked at the move 1e4 and I explained some of the key opening ideas for both sides from there. Now we're going to dive into move d4, and even though the machines consider d4 a little bit weaker than e4 objectively, I believe that white still gets a very nice advantage in these lines, which tend to be much more strategic and slower paced than the e4 lines, much like you see in normal chess. Now, knight f3 is the main move, and it's sort of interesting to see how the different variations play out, because some of the lines are kind of similar, but also a bit different to what you see in normal chess. For example, the move knight f6 is the most common one if we include transpositions, and it sort of is our first major branching point where white can choose his setup. For example, the move of bishop to f4, well, this is certainly the, let's say, most common move in this position, just playing a normal London system. And black in turn usually puts the bishop on f5, leading to this very symmetrical position after e3 and e6, where the onus is going to be on white to try to use his extra tempo and development. And in Crazyhouse, I find the move bishop d3 to be a very effective move in these positions. The reason for that is that if black does take on d3, I consider that to be a strategic mistake because if c takes d3, and black doesn't get the e4 square for the knight, but in turn, white will be able to put his knight on e5, and get a very strong attack in these positions. For example, bishop e7, castles. You know, white can put the knight on c3, knight bd7, and, well, we can kind of see it after knight e5 that, well, white can trade off the knights and potentially just pile on the dark squares. A theme that you very often see in these d4 systems is that white is going to put a pawn or even a bishop on h6, potentially sacrificing material, but being able to attack the black king. If the knights will be traded, you might also see a knight come to h5 as well. These are sort of ideas, along with various pins, that can really put a lot of piece pressure and leave black feeling very passive in these kind of positions. So that's why you generally don't see black play bishop d3. At a high level, you more often see them play the retreat bishop g6, but at the same time, bishop g6 is costing a fair bit of time for black, and white, of course, is not forced to take on g6. But instead, you can see that the e5 strong point is even more unpleasant for black in Crazyhouse chess than it is in normal chess. For example, if bishop d6, well, white can simply castle. And again, we get a very similar kind of position to what we saw before, where, for example, after knight bd7, there are a lot of good moves for white, but one that's quite appealing is to actually switch to playing on the light squares in such a position. One way in which you can do that is to play a move like knight takes g6, and then if h takes g6, there are a lot of different moves for white, but certainly a move like bishop at e5 is a nice way to kind of build the tension where if they do take, you're able to get take with the pawn and get a very nice space advantage that really comes in handy for when you drop pieces on the dark squares to attack the king. But then if they don't take, you can kind of go c4, trade off the pawn, and still drop a pawn on h6 to really pile on black's weak light squares, weak dark squares, I should say. So it's kind of the reason why I consider that this position is already significantly better for white. In fact, the best option for black may well be to play the move knight e4 himself, trying to avoid this kind of plan. I still feel that after castles that white is doing quite well, but at least black can kind of develop with bishop d6, or even a move like bishop e7 is also possible. You know, I can still go knight e5 and still kick the knight away, and probably still have an edge, but probably not as big an edge as we saw in some of the other lines before. That being said, we can kind of see the problems that black is facing if he tries to copy white in this opening, and that's why you see black often try different systems. For example, bishop g4 is also seen, but in that case, I find that knight e5 gives white quite a nice initiative. Probably it's even more effective if you'd play knight c3 in place of bishop f4, because the developing move kind of ends up being more useful. But it's still going to be a potential disadvantage of the move order for black. Because I think if you play a move like e3, which looks more normal, it's definitely possible, but I feel like with the pin that it does stop knight e5 and make it much harder for white to get his usual play. After bishop e2, black can even play a move like bishop b4 check, just trying to provoke a c3 move, because general principle in the Crazyhouse is that you often don't want to push your c-pawn, because if you do, you're kind of leaving, like say if black were to play c6, you're leaving yourself open to drops on c7, so it's kind of a philosophy that you generally don't push the c-pawn in Crazyhouse out of good reason. So I guess you go knight d2, and after castles, it does feel like a relatively healthy position for black. Another point in Crazyhouse also, because we don't often push the c-pawn, it means that often your knight is actually perfectly happy to go to c6 rather than on d7. It's a little bit more active, and you never know when you might want to play knight d4 to get a pawn in hand to attack on the light squares as black. Probably white is still a bit better, but black's position I think is relatively solid and playable, at least relatively speaking. Now, the approach that I think is objectively the strongest one for black, and the one that you see most of the top Crazyhouse players playing, is what I call the Grunfeld setup with the move g6. And the idea of g6 is, well, basically to castle and to build a very solid home for the king. And there are quite a few ways in which white can play this. I think the most common one, if we were to include transpositions, would be to put the knight on c3, which I think is a lot more critical than putting the knight on d2 by comparison. But black does have ways to play this where he can castle and kind of ask white how he's going to build up the attack. For example, if white were to play bishop d3, which is the best scoring move, well, black can go knight c6, and if castles, black can play bishop g4 as one candidate where he can try to trade off this knight. Although I do think white gets a pretty nice advantage, even h3 or bishop e2 both give white a very good position. But I think that the move knight b4 is probably a better try, though I don't think it solves all of black's problems, because even though you're able to get rid of this bishop, I still feel like the structure after knight e5, knight takes d3 and cd3 still has some potential for white. In practice, black does score very well, so perhaps after h6, perhaps we can say that black is also very solid and, relatively speaking, his position is quite good. But still, white has different ideas. For example, you could even consider playing a move like pushing the pawn to f4 and trying to then play on the light squares, but of course a very strategic position where ultimately the better player is going to win here and the game goes on. So that's actually one reason why I think that it is possible to improve on white's setup against the g6 lines. I mean, I guess one attempt is to go knight e5 and try to avoid moves like bishop g4. It also kind of dissuades knight c6 to some extent, because you get options like taking on c6 and dropping the knight back on e5, leaving with a weak pawn. Though in this version it might be better just to go bishop e2, and even knight like charging the h-pawn can be a creative alternative to the more normal castles and wait to drop something on h6, which black will usually stop with the pawn h6 move for what it's worth. But I still like white's chance a lot with, again, takes a knight e5, and just weaken the structure and just kind of take your chances from there, using the fact that black is also quite passive and mainly playing a defensive kind of setup. But I think that if you know your opponent is going to play g6, I think that a very effective response is to put the bishop on g5, or for that matter to play the move order knight c3, which I notice is one that the top Crazyhouse player at this time of recording, Catalan, that he likes this move knight c3 in these positions, with the idea that after g6 you can put the bishop on g5, which is of course a much more active square than f4. And the point is that after bishop g7, e3, that after castles, there's actually an idea that white normally doesn't play in practice. Normally he goes for moves like bishop d3 or bishop e2, and something like castles, knight e5, and plays in a very similar way to what we've seen before. And I guess you could make an argument that after bishop d3, that those sort of positions do tend to be still very promising for white. For example, bishop g4, it can even be met with a move like h3, and if black takes, well, we kind of see that again the bishop is a lot better on g5 than f4, because you're not letting black have a knight h4 to try and fork your queen and pawn and to play on the light squares. And also you have a lot more pressure on d5 that really gives you a much stronger initiative compared to the London. So that's certainly a very good system for white, and it's true that black has played different lines. I know, for example, that the player blitz bullet often goes to steps like knight d7 and h6 and c5, which objectively probably isn't the plan that gives black equality, but it can lead to some interesting play and try to set some problems for white. In any case, instead after castles, I think a more effective approach is the move bishop f6, which has hardly ever been played in practice, but it's actually very powerful, and it's actually a move that I've used myself to very good effect. Because a lot of my opponents play f6, but this actually falls into a very strong tactical trick. If you want, you could pause the video to see if you can find this for white. So well done if you came up with the following move. So you might notice that the e7 square is kind of a bit unexposed for black, and the move knight d5 is the way to exploit it. Because if black doesn't take the knight, he's just a pawn down, and of course pawn e7 is also kind of a threat. But if you play queen d5, there's knight e7, and you just win the queen. I've won a lot of games, even against very strong players, even some of the best players in Crazyhouse with this trick. So it's well worth keeping in mind. The more subtle point is that bishop f6 still leaves the black king very exposed. The move h4 is very strong here, and this is again a line that, has been played both by me and also Catalan, where you just go h5, force open the king side, and in doing so it just leaves the black king very exposed. Also he kind of has a bit of a hard time covering all his dark squares, because if you try to say put a bishop on g7, well then we can then pile on the light squares and use that weakness instead. So obviously this line is quite fresh territory, but white is doing very, very well but I think he is already close to winning here with correct play. So, for that reason, that's why you sometimes see players play a little differently. If black plays h6, you can kind of go bishop f6 anyway. Because even though you don't have the knight d5 tactic yet, it sort of stops black castling short. And I find a plan of putting the knight on f4 and sacking on g6 and just piling up on the light squares basically gives white a winning advantage. Black doesn't really manage to get enough pieces on the light squares because if you try to drop a black bishop on f5, you're always going to have moves like knight h4 to pile the pressure on the g6 square. That's been subtly but very significantly weakened by the pawn h6 move. So, in any case, that sort of shows that this g6 line, if white knows what he's doing, I think white does get a very big advantage. So in this move order, you'll often see people play moves like bishop f5 instead. Keep in mind that bishop g4, knight e5, and it's like queen d3 is going to give white a very strong initiative there. So in this case, well, we can still put the bishop on g5, and after e6, we're kind of transposing in a territory that it's true you could also reach via free bishop g5 if black had played bishop f5 in reply. Because a lot of these lines, white is going to play knight c3 anyway, so there are a lot of transpositions between the lines with d4. So often it becomes more about kind of understanding sort of when you play which move against which setup, as it were. But here, black really struggles, I think, to get a playable game. Because again, after bishop g7, bishop d3, we can see that the ideas are sort of similar to the London in that if they take, you get improve your structure. If they play bishop g6, you get knight e5 and a really strong stonewall attack with a later f4. And if they do let you take on this f5 point, like say if black were to castle, well, we kind of see that this structure is very inflexible, where this pawn is quite weak, and even if white were just to play normal moves like castles and knight e5 and put a bishop on the board, that black is really kind of struggling on both color complexes here. However, there's actually a better move than bishop d3 in this position, because bishop d3, knight e4 does at least allow black to trade some pieces and try to get a few pieces in hand for an attack potentially. The move bishop b5 is a little subtlety that is more effective, because if black goes knight d7, this is actually a trick that I've got in a lot of my games, which I learned from Catalan, looking at his games. And that's this move in knight e5 that is very strong, because you're threatening bishop f6 and to take on d7. If you play c6, it turns out you can actually sack the bishop for 2 pawns, and it all tactically works out. I realize that this might not be obvious to everyone, so I'll show it on the board that c6 is running into takes, and, takes. It's a good example of how you often want to make exchanges that allow you to kind of do so with tempo. So if they do move the queen, that you take, and well, I mean, after king e7, white has a lot of winning moves, but the simplest is probably pawn e5 or bishop a3 first. It's also possible to defend b2. But I mean, you're going to get the knight in hand with the pin, and black's king is just way too exposed to survive here. So that's why you normally see black castle, but in that case, you can, again, use some tactics with takes, and here it's also quite an important point if we were to compare this with the Verasov, with knight c3, bishop g5, like, let's say, for example, if white had played bishop h4 and then bishop e7, and black had the move h6 thrown in. In that case, this position with the pawn h6 would actually be very healthy for black, because white wouldn't have any good drops on the dark squares. But here white does with the move knight h6, a very nice trick that gh6 and knight at f6 will win the queen with the knight fork. But if king h8, white can go knight at e5, just again going for the forks. We see just how powerful the initiative is even in the d4 openings as well. And if black plays a move like queen e7, white has a lot of good replies, but I think the simplest is just to play bishop to g5. Again, using the fact that queen takes g5 will lose the queen to a knight fork. And if f6 is played to try and fork, well, you can take, and then just play knight d5, and, to a casual observer, it might seem like black is going to win a piece after the queen moves away. The reality, though, is that after knight takes f6, that the black king is just going to be way too exposed, where you can put the pawn on h6 and you just don't have a good blocker to deal with the pawn at g7 fork. We see that with that fork, white's going to get more material for the attack with tempo, and so black is just completely lost at this point. So in any case, it's quite an instructive variation. Of course, it's true that this line, well, is of course not a forced line, and it is true that black did make some mistakes along the way. But it's just something that has come up quite a lot in my own games when I played it with white in the past. So, and it's actually something I fell into as black when I was not so experienced in Crazyhouse. So it's definitely a trick that could win you some games. But as we can kind of understand why black plays c6. But now a very important distinction is that after bishop d3, the black doesn't have the move knight e4. That would actually be the best move in this particular position if the pawn was still on c7 here. Because after knight e4, now the difference is that after bishop e7, and bishop takes e4, well now the d6 square is fatally weakened by the pawn at c5 move. So you can just go bishop c at c5 and drop a knight on d6 if the queen moves. And blocking with the bishop doesn't really help, because after takes, and bishop at c5, for example, well, the knight's going to jump into d6 anyway, and it's pretty clear that with the king in the open, that black is getting murdered on the dark squares. And that's a very common theme in a lot of these openings for white, where white is going to play on the dark squares, and it's going to be very hard for black to really, well, be able to maintain the balance or to resist the initiative. Kind of like, opposite colored bishop positions in normal chess, for those who are familiar with those positions. When you kind of have the opposite colored bishops in the middle game, it's very hard to kind of resist the attack if you don't have, as I say, a dark squared bishop to deal with the dark squared attack. Similar concepts apply here in Crazyhouse too. I also want to show another line that's also very annoying against bishop f5, where actually this move of after say bishop f5 here, this is actually the most common move for black if we don't include transpositions, but I find that the move bishop g5 is very effective in reply, where bishop f5 is kind of the Jan Lee setup, where if you let black, let's say, get in a move like e6, like this is an example of what black is aiming for. He wants to play bishop d6, and kind of play a London with colours reversed, where let's say if white, for argument's sake, were to play knight e5, it's very important that black hasn't put the knight on f6, and by playing knight e7, and going for moves like castles, f6, and knight c6, black will be able to evict the knight from e5, and black will have the much more flexible pawn structure, which actually ends up being quite significant in Crazyhouse to not give the opponent any weaknesses to kind of target, in a sense, in your pawn structure. I mean, knight f7 is not really going to work when you don't have a lot of material in hand to follow up. It's one thing that's important to understand that with bughouse chess, these knight f7 sacks make sense because your opponent can kind of get the material in hand to kind of follow like knight at g5, piece on f7, and so forth. But in Crazyhouse, the pieces have to come from the exchanging with your opponents or taking the opponent's pieces, so it's obviously a very different dynamic. An important pitfall to kind of avoid as well, for those of you who are relatively new to Crazyhouse. It is very different to bughouse, but of course there is some similarity with the pieces dropping on the board, as it were. In any case, bishop g5 is the line I think is the problem for black, where the best option for black might actually be to play a move like h6, and then to play something like knight f6 and g6. But in that case, you're committed to the move bishop f5 early, and I consider that to be a little bit of a concession, because again, if white plays a move like bishop d3, then this structure again is super pleasant for white, where black doesn't have a square for the knight. White moves like castles, knight c6, knight e5 kind of play themselves. And white's just going to kind of build up the position on the dark squares and say black is very passive. And I find very often these lines that the dark square attack does translate into a light squared attack with some sack on f7 or e6 in the middle game. Like if we play some moves on the board to kind of make, I guess, a little bit more obvious, kind of a position like this, well, it would sort of be a good demonstration where you can sort of see that white can exchange and drop a knight on e5, or even do something like drop a piece on f7 and put something on e6 and just kind of switch to play to the light squares, as it were. That's something you see quite a lot in the middle game, sometimes supported by bishop h3, and you're trying to pressure from a distance. Speaking of that, actually, I should point out that if we were to see black play f6, well, in this case, the white more often plays bishop h4 in practice, but when I looked at Katask's games, who seems to be the big d4 expert for white, along with, I guess, Jasugi, who also plays d4 a lot, well, bishop d2 is a really nice subtlety. I know that in, let's say, classical chess, this move might seem a little bit weird, but there's actually a certain logic that the bishop on h5 is actually very misplaced. Actually, knight c3 is probably a more precise move order than e3, to be fair. The point is that after bishop d6, that white can now play the move knight to h4, and kind of ask some questions for black about how he's going to defend the bishop. Because if you play bishop g6, you kind of allow white to take and go e4, and get a very strong initiative in the center, where we can kind of see here that, well, that this move of g6 point is quite weak, and, well, d4 and a4 just gives white even more space in the center. So black's in very big trouble in this line. Instead, the move knight e7 is more solid, but it actually runs into a nice trap that black often falls into. Again, it's a trap I've caught out many players in my games. And that is, if black were to play to move castles, it actually is a tactical blunder here. And the reason for that is because of the move knight takes d5. And if black were to take the knight, if you don't take knight, you're just down a lot of material. Then bishop at e6, and you're just going to take the knight next move. And then when moves like bishop 8 takes h7, you just pile on the light squares here, and black is not really able to defend the attack from all these pieces, as it were. Again, seeing the power of the color complex in play. That's why the move knight c6 first is a lot more reliable, but we can still play on the light squares with moves like bishop d3. And there are a lot of different ways black can try to defend, but say if he plays a move like knight c7, for example, well, we can put the bishop on h3, and you kind of see how we're sort of threatening even moves like knight takes d5 or bishop takes f5. Even a move like e4 can often be a good plan to just open up the position on the light squares. Black's really missing a good light squared bishop like on f7 or d7 to defend himself, and so it leaves black in big trouble. Actually, the computer thinks that going knight d5 and sacking the piece for positional compensation is even better. Try and get a bishop into e6. But okay, I think that white should have a lot of good moves at this point, to be fair. And strategy is about generally piling on these squares. Again, I play like a lot of games, and Katask play even more games than I did, kind of showing the problems for black in these lines. So in any case, that's sort of the reason why I think that ultimately, after bishop g5, I do think white has a very serious advantage. And it's sort of why you often see black play a little bit differently. Like if we take knight f6 and bishop g5 by comparison, well, obviously there's some differences, like after h6, the black gets the extra option of g5, for example. But in that case, I find that these positions, it's a better version if you don't have the knight on f3, and the reason is that here, strategically, say after e3 and knight c6, you would really want to play a move like h4 if your knight was on g1. But with the knight on f3, it doesn't really make sense, because it'll take you too long to get the ideal maneuver of knight g2 and knight f4 to put the pressure on d5 and hit some weaknesses on the queen side. So this is kind of a better version of these positions for black, and the reason that black plays knight c6 specifically is so that he can meet bishop d3 with knight b4 and try to play on the light squares himself, often dropping a bishop on f5 after that to make sure that his light squares are well covered for defense as well as for attack. So normally white's going to go knight c3 to be kind of flexible, and then after castles you get this sort of tabia position with bishop d3. Bishop b5 is also possible, but I think it's kind of important to stop knight e4 and not let black get that sort of knight on a very stable square, kind of like we saw in some other lines. But it does allow knight b4. I think that these positions here, after knight e5, takes, probably objectively speaking, the position is somewhat close to equal, but white tends to score very well in practice here, where it's not that easy for black to kind of, let's say, put a bishop on h3 and just mate the white king on the light squares, though it's not a completely ridiculous idea either for the middle game. So it's a position with chance for both sides, but definitely a lot easier to play white, who can kind of play an easy moves like castles and f4 to kind of open up the black king as well, is often a plan that works well if black were to play a little bit passively here. In any case, so g5, it's a playable setup, but it's more effective than the lines where he developed f3. Speaking of which, I should also touch on the lines where white does a move order a little differently, say with knight to c3. Because after knight c3, bishop f5, I think that in this case the move to bishop g5 is again the logical move order, where we kind of see the difference that now f6, well actually it's kind of going to be the same thing, because it's going to transpose anyway after e6, knight f3 with bishop d2. But there are some differences with a pawn on h6 where, like I said, in this case the g5 plan is a lot less effective, where it's kind of a strategic mistake to combine g5 with bishop f5, because then white's going to get the ideal cd3 structure later on. Just bear with me as I fix the misclick. Okay, so therefore instead you'll more often see black play something like knight f6 and then g6, and try to play like this, saying that you at least committed white to h6, bishop h4, because obviously bishop f6 wasn't available earlier. But even so, I think that the move bishop d3 works quite well, and even this structure it takes in bishop d3 is also quite appealing, where again you can kind of put the knight even on e2 as well as f3, because often knight e2 is quite good for dealing with a bishop b4 pin. That can sometimes be a little bit annoying in some Verasov lines. Like, say for example, if black were to play knight f6, and we take the Verasov here as an example, knight free transpose to what we looked at in bishop f4 is kind of going to be similar to positions that we've already seen anyway. Well, one important difference is after h6 that, if white were to play bishop f6, well, black takes, and, with the bishop on b4, say after this or after first knight c6, well, black can sort of put pressure on this knight, and even though white's position is certainly playable, the fact that black hasn't played g6 means that this is a very solid position for him for when he does eventually castle short. So I think in general, with the bishop in hand, black should be doing quite okay here. I know, for example, bishop d3, that, bishop at a3 is one interesting tactic you can go for, where you kind of try to lure this knight away to weaken the structure and, weaken white a bit in that sense. So instead, well, white can try to play differently, like you can put the bishop on h4, But once again, this sort of shows why I think the Veresov move order is slightly inaccurate compared to knight f3, because now black gets extra options like playing pawn to g6, and well, in that case, black definitely benefits from the fact that h6 bishop and 4 has been thrown in. For example, now after knight f3 in castles, well, it doesn't make as much sense to play bishop f6, because now this h6 move gives a very useful extra tempo in defending against h4, h5, which is a lot less effective. I guess in theory you could still play bishop d3 and still, say, go for knight e5 and try a sack on g6, saying that h6 is a bit weakening. But black is also going to kind of deal with that with knight c6, and, well, knight e5 doesn't really work anymore after takes and knight g4, and then there are too many weaknesses. So I kind of have to play more slowly with a move like castles or h3. And, well, then there are definitely chances for both sides. Maybe white is still somewhat better, but at least with these moves thrown in, it's a better version for black. So that's why the Veresov is maybe objectively a little inaccurate, but it's true if your opponent's not familiar with the move order, it could cause some problems. And finally, the one other move I kind of want to touch on is the move bishop f4, because I know that this accelerated London used to give me massive headaches, because basically the lines with bishop f5, e3, bishop d3 are a much better version for white, actually, even than what we saw before, because black doesn't have the option of knight e4 to block, which is kind of important here in order to try to fight for the initiative. However, black has an extra option of bishop g4 that tends to be more effective when white has not played knight f3 yet. A key point is that if you play f3, well, black can actually play a move like either bishop h5 or bishop to f5, where bishop f5 is kind of interesting actually, where you say that the extra f3 move is sort of taking away f3 from the knight. And those position link with e3, e6 are actually reasonably solid, after bishop d3. Black can try to play a move like bishop b4 and try to be annoying, for instance. But more often, black does play bishop h5 in practice. And okay, you might notice there's a certain similarity to, let's say, a 2 bishop g5 line by white, but with an extra tempo for white here. So in this case, white's standard setup, if the pawn's on f3, is to play something like bishop d3 and, after bishop d6 to go knight e2, and just kind of keep the tension. But I find that black generally does quite okay in these positions, where it can either go knight f6, or play more flexibly with knight e7 himself. And one thing you're often going to see in these positions, and I know also from playing them as black, where black will kind of put the bishop on g6 and knight on c6, and kind of just say he has no real weaknesses. And whereas with f3 played, black can often think about playing moves like bishop f4, knight f5 to go after the weak e3 point, and often even see the bishop join in from a bishop at h6 after these bishops have been traded. So black definitely has potential for counterplay, though it has to be said the computer does think that the novelty bishop d6 and knight f4 is going to give white a nice initiative where white can try to play on the light squares before black plays on the dark squares. So that's definitely a line that has some potential for white, but it's not necessarily game over either. So in short, I think bishop g4, well, it's a very playable move, and it is one I think that objectively is probably quite okay for black, but there are some subtleties, and certainly there are other approaches as well. For example, white could also play h3 and just sort of play kind of just normal chess like knight f3, and kind of get a bishop to g4 line into London, but where h3 and bishop h5 is a somewhat useful insertion. I mean, you never know when white might go g4 and knight e5 and even think about fighting for the initiative himself at some moment. It's an idea that definitely can be explored, but probably the more solid setup is better here. And okay, sure, I'd probably spend a bit too much time talking about these subtleties, because there are a lot of them, and I think that, well, sort of just saying that the London is a candidate is not probably doing justice to the depth of these positions. But these are the kind of ideas that when I understood them, it allowed me to get to a 2,600 plus level, or at least 2,500 plus knowing some of these subtleties. So it's true that black is not forced to play the move d5, that he does have alternatives. I'm only going to really look at the move knight f6, because most of the other moves are going to transpose later anyway, after black plays later knight f6 or later d5, though of course there are some exceptions. And again, this is a position where if white were to play knight c3, I mean, if black may as well should play d5, but it's something that we've already covered before. Because if you don't play d5, white's going to go e4 next move, and black's going to get moved on into a line of 1 e4 that objectively is weaker than, let's say, if he played 1 e4, e5, or 1 e4, knight f6. So knight c3 can be quite a decent move if you want to force black into a d5 position, saying, okay, if you start with 1 f6, maybe it's not with d5 as a follow-up. But the more common continuation for white is the move knight to f3. It's the most flexible move, because I find if you play bishop f4 that what a lot of players do, and actually it's the reason that I switched to knight f6 later on in my Crazyhouse times, is because I want to have the option of playing d6 and showing out the bishop. And that's an approach that tends to be fairly solid for black, because if knight f3, there's this very aggressive setup with bishop to g4, e3, and then knight c6 they had very good results with. And the idea is just to go e5, using the pin on the knight, and then e4, getting quite a nice initiative. In fact, if bishop e2, it turns out e5 is already quite strong. We're trying to take the pawn e5 is going to mean that your king's going to be stuck in the center after all the exchanges on e5 and d1, and you basically get a winning attack in the complications. And if white tries to keep the tension, like bishop g5 is probably best, but you can go bishop e7, or you can go e4, and either way you kind of get a nice position where your piece is all on good squares, and white hasn't really managed to prove an edge here in my opinion. If anything, it's probably actually already better for black. So if white wants to fight for an edge, he probably should play the move d5 here. But even then in this position, I mean, you can still play knight d5, and it's all quite standard in these d6 lines to sack a piece, but kind of then get a strong center and get some compensation. Where, I mean, it's not that easy for white to use the extra knight, and as far as Crazyhouse openings go, this one is pretty good by most standards for black, in that you're not losing and you probably get almost full compensation, let's say. So the worst case is really not bad at all, and it's why I think knight f3 is the better move. So you kind of wait to see what black does. Obviously, d5 is going to transpose back into the lines that we just saw beforehand with one d5. The move d6 is the most common alternative, and actually a system that I kind of was playing as well at some point, just sort of playing, let's say, normal chess. However, objectively speaking, d6 is not very good because of the move knight c3. Again, with the idea that if white gets an e4, he gets these very promising d6 lines for white, or with one e4. They actually covered it briefly in the previous video. So usually they play bishop f5 and try to stop it, but then it turns out that actually it doesn't technically stop e4. e4 is still a very strong move, and it's quite fortunate that more of my opponents didn't know this fact. I think very few people played e4 against me, and they let me get the very solid knight d7, e6, and this kind of setup. But this line's a big problem, because after knight e4 we see that after takes, and now knight to g5. Well, this pawn is a big issue for black. I mean, knight at g5 is also not bad. But with this move order, it allows you to play like knight to f4. There are other good moves as well, but the idea is just to take. And then you just pile on these weak light squares, which are very, very hard for black to defend. And it turns out that white is probably technically winning, even though on score, black actually wins quite well after e6. But objectively, I think that even a sack on e6 is probably very strong. It's a novelty, but I think it really leaves black in trouble. I mean, of course, knight g6 and queen f3, and just going for the normal kind of pressure. I mean, this is probably the most convincing, where black isn't really able to defend on the light squares without his light squared bishop, or without a bishop in hand to drop on the board. So, instead of d6, what else can black do? Well, it could play the move knight to c6, for example, and kind of wait to see what up white goes for. But I find that white has a lot of good replies. I mean, knight c6 and d5 is one possible branch that you could get. Which, I mean, is a position you could get for a lot of different move orders, with d5 being the stop e4. But I find that white's doing pretty well in these positions. For example, bishop f4. You kind of can say that knight b5 can be an annoying idea if they were to play some quiet move. Or if they play bishop g4 and try to unbalance things. I mean, I guess this position is one that's kind of similar to what we've seen before. You can play bishop e2, put your knight on e5, and I mean, I don't think white has a big edge, but this position is definitely somewhat more pleasant to play. Alternatively, white also has other approaches. I mean, d5 is kind of the move if you want to really punish their move order. I mean, black can sack a piece so with knight d5, and I mean, black will get some compensation, but I don't think it's enough to equalize at least. So, in any case, we can see that most of the other moves are going to transpose to other lines. For example, g6, I mean, the simplest is just to go knight c3, and black is almost certainly going to go either d5 and not allow e4, or which is kind of something we already saw before with bishop g5 and so forth, or otherwise white gets an e4 and we transpose to a Pyrrhus defense. I guess the one other independent option is to go e6, and well, it's kind of interesting how this can play out, because sometimes black will play it with a Queen's Indian idea, which I know that Jan Lee often did quite successfully against me, but white has quite a few good replies. I mean, bishop g5, the torre, does gaining strength bit when you have the pin. I remember actually I had some quite good results against Jan Lee, playing e3, and then after d6 just going like knight c3, and kind of just playing bishop d3 castles and just developing very normally. There are a lot of ways to play a position, it's not exactly very theoretical, but white gets more space, and it's not that easy for black to find a good active plan due to the passive nature of e6, d6. I mean, you could play against anything, but you are kind of making a bit of a concession playing like this. Finally, there's one other setup actually. Well, before I show it, I should point out just quickly that the move e5 doesn't really come recommended, because you just take, and the England Gambit doesn't really work in Crazyhouse either. Normally if they play this, it's with some d6, but there are a lot of good ways to deal with this. I mean, the move bishop g5 is the most common, where you just go after the queen and, well, kind of say that after bishop e7, you can just take on e7 and d6, and kind of just leave black with a very weak structure, like this. And, well, you can kind of see how this plays out, where obviously this position after e6. I mean, bishop at h4 might be even better, but anyway, it's kind of clear that this sort of position, the white's kind of just a pawn up, and black doesn't really have a lot of compensation for it. Actually, maybe pawn at f4 could be a bit tricky in this case, so it might be better to start with another move first. Like a move like knight c3 first might be more precise, so that you've got knight d5 in certain positions. So in any case, I guess there is bishop h4, which probably is the, might actually be the better move. Or for that matter, actually knight c3 is sort of the move that kind of is the official refutation, but it's sort of some complex theory and kind of not really that essential, considering that e5 is the bad move for black. The one step I haven't covered yet, which can be played against pretty much anything, is called the Catalan setup, which is where you pretty much just go g3 and just kind of play this bishop g2, castles h3 without really thinking, and often moves like knight c3, bishop f4, knight e5. It's kind of a very standard setup for white, where the player Blitz Bullet, also known as Jalen Wang, the international master. He's one of the very top Crazyhouse players, I think number 3, and I think of all the top players, actually, I think the ones I've played a lot, I sort of have the worst record against him by far, actually, where he just plays very solidly, like bishop f5, for example. He goes bishop g2. Actually, normally he plays the h3 move order, but it usually ends up transposing anyway, like bishop e7, and I mean, this is definitely a very solid setup for black, with castles and knight c3, so it's definitely very legitimate, but it's only a position where the engine doesn't really understand, because the engine will tell you that black is quite a bit better. But I think the objective assessment is probably equality. I can either put the knight on e5 directly, or you can prepare it with bishop f4 and then knight e5. And often the idea is that you're going to play moves like knight c6 and drop the knight back on e5, saying that black's structure is not so flexible. And sometimes you'll even see why I play moves like knight takes d5, just to get a pawn in hand with pawn h6, and going for take on g7 and kind of piling on black's weak dark squares. The main point of this setup is that basically the white king is very safe. It's very hard for black to get a good drop to attack in such a position. So it becomes a very strategic battle where even if, let's say, black manages to win material, white's safer king may well give him the advantage in a lot of cases. So it's one of these lines of base, I think it's probably the most frustrating one to play against, at least for me. I mean, I would say if there was one line that made me give up Crazyhouse, probably this is the line that did it, because it was just so tilting to play these systems and lose like an idiot from positions that just looked winning, but were actually not so simple in practice. But that's kind of a whole other story. There are other approaches other than bishop f5, but I think bishop f5 is probably the most reliable equalizer. I should point out there's also the knight d7 setups, where you can also play like this with, sorry, not bishop e3, but knight e5. And I mean, there are ways black can play, like playing moves like c6, or even considering moves like c5, and just trying to play a more positional game. But again, white still has a pretty active setup, and definitely, well, his position is quite playable, even if moves like knight h5 can, sometimes be a little bit annoying. I mean, in principle, black wants to eventually get a knight on e4, h5, and try to put some pressure on g3 and f2, but it's not always so easy to do in practice, so it's definitely a game where both sides do have their chances, and ultimately the better player is very likely to win, which is why you often see the top players play this with one side. Actually, often what a lot of the top players actually will copy with a move like g6, and then after bishop g2, you kind of get this system, castles, where, the players kind of just copy each other, like h3, h6, and I find these symmetrical positions are generally very solid. I don't think it's that easy for white to use as extra tempo. I remember I was looking at these positions, I think I came to the conclusion that bishop e3 and bishop e6, and kind of going for the h6 pawn might be the best setup, because there's often a lot of cases actually, say if we take bishop f4 as the example, there are a lot of positions where you can actually end up sacking on h6 and even sacking the queen in order to drop something on g5 and attack on the dark squares. It looks completely ridiculous, but Jalen Wang has won a lot of games, especially against me, with these kind of ideas. So it's definitely a very original and interesting way to play the position. In fact, after bishop f4, it may well be that black should actually consider a move like knight e4 and try to get some sort of play that way, as it were. And of course, white can go knight e5 himself, which is the most common line, and it's one of these situations where the computers will tell you that black is doing quite well, but in reality, it's often white scores very highly. I tried different moves like bishop f5 and bishop e6 in practice, but in general, I really struggled to find something I really liked. Probably bishop e6 is the best move, but I still think white's position is a bit easier to play, like knight at c6, knight e5. The moves kind of play themselves for white, whereas black has to be a bit more careful. in terms of strategic planning to find a way to attack the white king or get good counterplay otherwise. And of course, the g3 step can be played in a lot of other versions. I mean, I think that probably it's not really the place to go into it deeply. I mean, you could obviously play it against knight f6 systems or against other weird sort of lines. But in general, you can sort of see it as the general gamut of setups at white's disposal, from things like the Torre to the Catalan to the London. And of course, there are a few other move orders that we also saw, like Veresov's. And okay, it's not a comprehensive coverage, but I think it gives you a pretty good idea of both what the objective theoretical standing is of these lines, showing the lines where I do think white is considerably better, let's say clearly better after d4, and lines where black is sort of doing okay, is only slightly worse, or in certain cases not even worse at all, if white were to mess up the move order a bit. So definitely a very strategic battle, and I hope that, in going a bit deeper into some of the lines and actually explaining why some other moves aren't played, they can give you a good feel for these sort of positions, so you can kind of see what you're aiming for in a kind of middle games and what sort of traps you typically want to avoid, both tactically and on a strategic level. So anyway, if you enjoyed this video or you learned something new from it, make sure to leave a like. If you're new to the channel, subscribe to keep up to date with more of my videos, and I will see you in the next chess video, dear chess friends.